The Atlantic Ocean was calm during the early hours of the morning. USS Theodore Roosevelt was operating off the eastern coast of the United States, conducting routine training exercises before deployment. For the pilots and crew on board, everything about the mission felt normal. New radar systems had recently been installed on the F/A-18 Super Hornet jets. These systems were more sensitive than anything the pilots had used before. They were designed to improve situational awareness, track airborne objects more accurately, and reduce risk during flight operations. Shortly after the upgrades, radar operators began noticing unfamiliar tracks. Small objects appeared at high altitude, well above commercial air traffic. They did not broadcast transponder signals. They did not match known aircraft profiles. At first, the contacts were assumed to be sensor errors. The objects were detected repeatedly. They appeared, disappeared, and then returned. Some were tracked at altitudes above 30,000 feet. Others seemed to descend rapidly and then stop. The radar systems were functioning normally, and no malfunctions were reported. As training flights continued, pilots were briefed about the unusual radar contacts. The information was shared quietly, without alarm. No official explanation was available, but the decision was made to continue monitoring the objects during routine missions. Over the following days, the radar contacts became more frequent. The objects were observed during daylight and nighttime operations. Their presence did not interfere with missions, but their behavior did not match any known aircraft or drone systems. At this stage, the encounters remained purely technical. They existed as data points on screens and brief notes in flight reports. No visual confirmation had been made yet, and no one aboard the carrier suspected how close these objects actually were. As the Roosevelt continued its operations in the Atlantic, the radar systems remained active, tracking the sky continuously. And without changing course or speed, the carrier group moved steadily forward, unaware that these early detections were the beginning of a series of encounters that would later be acknowledged by the U.S. Department of Defense. As the training schedule continued, the radar contacts did not stop. In fact, they became predictable. Nearly every day, during specific training windows, the same unidentified objects appeared in the same areas of airspace. Pilots began to trust that what they were seeing was not a malfunction. The radar systems were cross-checked against other sensors. Everything confirmed the same result. The objects were real, and they were operating in controlled military airspace without identification. During one flight, a pilot visually observed an object at high altitude. It did not resemble a conventional aircraft. It appeared smooth and dark, with a geometric shape that was difficult to define at first glance. There were no wings, no visible propulsion, and no exhaust trail. As the jet closed distance, the shape became clearer. The object looked like a solid cube enclosed within a transparent sphere. It maintained a stable position in the air, unaffected by wind or turbulence. The pilot reported the sighting immediately. Radar data matched the visual observation. Other aircraft in the area confirmed similar readings. The object remained stationary for an extended period before slowly drifting out of range. These sightings were no longer limited to radar screens. Pilots were now seeing the objects with their own eyes. The encounters were calm but unsettling, not because of sudden movements, but because of how controlled and deliberate the objects appeared. Flight operations continued without interruption. No evasive maneuvers were ordered. The objects did not display hostile behavior. Still, The lack of identification and the repeated nature of the encounters raised concerns among aircrew and safety officers. As reports accumulated, the objects became a known factor in daily briefings. They were discussed carefully, without speculation. No one attempted to define what the objects were. The focus remained on documenting their behavior as accurately as possible. By this point, the encounters had moved beyond anomaly status. They had become part of the operational environment. And with each flight, the distance between observation and direct interaction continued to shrink. As flights continued, the behavior of the objects became more consistent. They were often detected at high altitude, remaining in position for long periods of time. In some cases, they were tracked for hours without noticeable change in speed or direction. Weather conditions did not appear to affect them. Strong winds at altitude failed to move the objects off position. They did not drift like balloons, nor did they maneuver like conventional aircraft. Their motion, when it occurred, was controlled and deliberate. During one mission, a pilot maneuvered closer to one of the contacts to gain a clearer visual. As the aircraft approached, the object changed position. The movement was sudden but smooth, covering distance faster than expected without any visible acceleration trail. Sensors attempted to lock onto the object. Infrared systems showed minimal heat signature. The lack of thermal output did not match jet engines, drones, or known experimental platforms. The object remained visible on radar even as it moved away. Pilots reported the encounters using standard safety and intelligence channels. The tone of the reports was factual and restrained. There was no excitement in the language, only careful descriptions of altitude, speed, shape, and behavior. During one flight, the separation distance closed unexpectedly. A pilot later described the event as a near mid-air collision. The object crossed the flight path at close range before accelerating away. The encounter lasted only seconds, but it changed how the situation was viewed. After that incident, the objects were no longer treated as passive observations. They were classified as a potential flight safety hazard. Command staff requested more detailed tracking and documentation. As the Roosevelt continued its training cycle, infrared cameras were activated more frequently. Radar data was preserved. Flight logs grew longer. The focus remained on collecting clear information, not drawing conclusions. Without any formal announcement, the encounters had shifted from background anomalies to active operational concerns. And as the carrier group pressed forward, the decision to observe quietly gave way to a need to record everything that could be seen. With increased monitoring in place, pilots began using onboard infrared systems more deliberately. These systems were designed to detect heat differences at long range and provide stable tracking during fast-moving engagements. During one of these flights, an object was captured clearly on infrared. It appeared bright against the colder background of the sky. The object maintained altitude and orientation while moving steadily across the frame. There were no visible control surfaces, and no heat plume followed its movement. As the camera tracked the object, it appeared to rotate. The rotation was smooth and constant. The pilot commented on what was being seen, attempting to describe the motion in real time while maintaining course and altitude. The object did not respond to the aircraft's presence in any obvious way. It did not accelerate toward the jet or move defensively. It continued on its path until it gradually exited the tracking field. This recording would later become known publicly as the gimbal video. At the time, It was simply another data file added to the growing collection of unexplained encounters. On a separate mission, another object was observed moving above the ocean surface. Infrared tracking showed it traveling at high apparent speed. The pilots attempted to calculate distance and velocity while maintaining visual contact. The object remained low over the water, producing no visible disturbance on the surface. It did not create a wake, splash, or spray. The infrared system continued to track it as it moved steadily forward. This footage would later be referred to as the Go Fast video. Like the previous recording, it was logged and stored without public attention. After each flight, pilots returned to the carrier and completed standard debriefings. The encounters were discussed calmly. Video files were reviewed. Radar data was archived. No explanations were provided, and none were requested during these sessions. The training operations continued. Jets launched and recovered as scheduled. The carrier maintained its course. And while the encounters were now documented on multiple systems, they remained unaddressed beyond internal reporting channels. As weeks passed, the encounters did not escalate, but they also did not stop. The objects continued to appear in the same general areas of airspace, following no identifiable pattern that matched military or civilian operations. Pilots adjusted their expectations. Seeing unidentified contacts on radar became part of the routine. Still, every sighting was logged. Every track was recorded. The focus remained on accuracy and consistency. There was no indication that the objects were communicating. They did not transmit signals. They did not respond to radio calls. They simply occupied space in the sky, moving when they chose to move, remaining still when they did not. Command staff reviewed the collected data periodically. Radar tracks, infrared footage, and pilot reports were compared. The information confirmed that the encounters were not isolated incidents. They were recurring events observed by multiple crews using different aircraft and systems. Despite the growing volume of data, no immediate action was taken. The objects showed no hostile behavior. There were no attempts to intercept them aggressively. The priority remained flight safety and documentation. When the training cycle neared completion, the Roosevelt prepared to leave the area. The final flights were conducted under the same conditions as the first. The unidentified objects were still present, still unclassified, and still unexplained. Once operations concluded, the data was forwarded through established intelligence channels. The footage and reports were marked for further review. After that, daily life aboard the carrier returned to normal. For the pilots, the encounters remained personal memories rather than public events. There were no briefings, no press statements, and no official discussions beyond what was required. As time moved on, the recordings remained stored within military systems. The objects were not named. They were not identified. They existed only as entries in logs and files, waiting quietly for a moment when they would no longer remain unseen. Years passed without public acknowledgement. The pilots moved on to new assignments. The carrier completed its deployments. The encounters were not discussed outside of classified settings, and the recordings remained inaccessible to anyone without authorization. During this time, similar reports began surfacing quietly from other Navy units. Pilots operating in different regions described comparable radar contacts and visual sightings. The details varied, but the patterns were familiar. Inside the Department of Defense, interest in unexplained aerial phenomena began to increase. Analysts reviewed older cases alongside newer data. The Roosevelt encounters were no longer isolated files. They became part of a larger collection of unresolved reports. In 2017, information about previously classified Navy footage began to appear in the media. Short infrared clips were released, showing objects that could not be readily identified. Among them were recordings from the Roosevelt training period. At first, the response was cautious. Officials neither confirmed nor denied the authenticity of the footage. The videos circulated widely, raising questions without offering answers. In April 2020, the Department of Defense confirmed that the footage was real. The recordings had been captured by Navy aircraft. The objects shown in the videos were officially classified as unidentified aerial phenomena. The confirmation did not include explanations. No conclusions were offered regarding origin or purpose. The statement was limited to authenticity and classification. With that acknowledgement, the encounters were no longer internal matters. What had once been quiet observations during routine training flights became part of a global discussion. Despite the attention, the facts remained unchanged. The objects had been tracked by radar. They had been recorded on infrared systems. They had been visually observed by trained pilots. And even with years of review and analysis, the Roosevelt encounters remained unresolved, leaving behind a record of events that began calmly over the Atlantic and ended with questions that are still unanswered. Following the public confirmation, analysts and experts began reviewing the footage in detail. Some focused on sensor behavior, examining how infrared systems interpret distance, speed, and angle. Others compared the data to known aircraft, drones, and atmospheric phenomena. Several explanations were proposed. Some suggested the apparent speed in the recordings could be influenced by camera angle and relative motion. Others pointed to optical effects caused by infrared tracking systems. These assessments addressed parts of the footage, but none accounted for every detail reported by pilots and radar operators. What remained consistent were the original observations. The objects had no visible wings. They showed no conventional propulsion. They produced little or no detectable heat. They were tracked by multiple systems over extended periods of time. The Navy responded by updating its reporting procedures. Pilots were encouraged to formally document any future encounters. The goal was clarity, not speculation. The term UFO was avoided, replaced by UAP, reflecting an effort to treat the subject as an unresolved technical issue. Public interest continued, but within the military, the encounters were approached carefully. No claims were made about origin. No conclusions were drawn about intent. The events were recorded as unknowns, nothing more and nothing less. Looking back, the Roosevelt encounters stood out not because of dramatic confrontation, but because of their consistency. The objects appeared repeatedly. They behaved in controlled ways. They were observed by trained professionals using reliable equipment. The Atlantic operations eventually faded into history, but the data remained. Stored recordings, filed reports, confirmed footage. Together, they formed a clear record of something that operated in restricted airspace without explanation. And even now, long after the carrier completed its mission and the pilots moved on, the encounters remain defined by a simple fact. They happened. They were observed. And they have not yet been explained. With time, the Roosevelt encounters became a reference point for later investigations. When new reports emerged from other Navy strike groups, analysts compared them to the Atlantic data. Similarities were noted in altitude, movement, and sensor behavior. These comparisons suggested that the phenomenon was not limited to one location or one deployment. The Roosevelt events were part of a broader pattern that had gone largely unrecognized for years. Despite increased attention, no additional information was released that changed the original record. The videos remained short. The reports remained technical. The conclusions remained open. What gave the encounters weight was not speculation, but process. Standard procedures were followed. Equipment functioned as designed. Multiple witnesses described the same events independently. For the pilots involved, the experience did not alter daily operations or career paths. It remained a professional memory, grounded in routine flights that briefly intersected with something unfamiliar. The Navy continued to train. Radar systems improved. Reporting became more structured. The sky over the Atlantic returned to appearing ordinary. Yet the encounters left a quiet mark. They demonstrated that even in heavily monitored airspace, not everything can be immediately identified. The Roosevelt sailed on. The ocean remained calm. And somewhere above that same stretch of water, the question raised during those training flights continues to exist, unchanged by time or attention. As official reviews continued, the language surrounding the encounters stayed careful and limited. Reports focused on what was observed, not what was assumed. Every conclusion stopped where verified data ended. The events did not lead to public briefings or detailed explanations. No follow-up footage was released. The encounters remained defined by a small set of recordings and consistent pilot testimony. Over time, the Roosevelt case was cited in government reports as an example of unresolved aerial activity. It helped shape how future sightings would be documented and evaluated. The emphasis remained on safety, transparency, and accurate data collection. For those who experienced it directly, the memory was clear and simple. Objects were present. They were tracked. They behaved in ways that could not be immediately explained. Nothing more was added to that account. There was no final report that closed the case. No statement that resolved the questions raised during those flights. The encounters were neither dismissed nor explained away. They remained what they had always been. A sequence of routine missions interrupted by repeated observations of unknown objects operating in controlled airspace. Long after the training flights ended, the record stayed intact. Radar tracks, infrared footage, written reports, all pointing to the same conclusion. The USS Theodore Roosevelt encounters did not change the sky. They did not alter naval operations. But they quietly demonstrated that even with advanced technology and constant monitoring, some events remain unidentified. And that is where the story continues to rest. Not in speculation or conclusions, but in documented observations that still wait for an explanation. In the years that followed, the encounters were referenced without emphasis or interpretation. They appeared in summaries, brief mentions in reports, and quiet acknowledgments during discussions about airspace awareness. Nothing new was added to the original observations. No additional data emerged that changed how the events were understood. The objects were still described the same way they had been during the flights. Unidentified, controlled, and inconsistent with known systems. As technology advanced, expectations grew that future encounters might be easier to explain. Improved sensors, better data sharing, and clearer reporting standards were put in place. Even so, the Roosevelt events remained unchanged by these developments. They stood as a reminder that detection does not always lead to identification. That observation does not always lead to explanation. For the Navy, the response was practical. Continue monitoring. Continue recording. continue reporting without assumptions. And so the story does not conclude with answers or revelations. It remains where it began, over a calm stretch of ocean, during routine operations, when trained professionals observed something real, documented it carefully, and left behind a record that still has no final explanation. The encounters eventually settled into the background of official history. They were neither highlighted nor dismissed. They existed as verified events with limited information and no resolution. When questions were raised publicly, responses remained brief. Officials confirmed authenticity but avoided interpretation. The focus stayed on process, not conclusions. What made the Roosevelt encounters different from earlier cases was the consistency of documentation. Multiple sensors, multiple pilots, repeated observations over time. Each element supported the others without contradiction. There was no single dramatic moment that defined the events. No sudden confrontation. No clear departure. The objects appeared, behaved consistently, and then were no longer observed when the carrier left the area. In that sense, the encounters ended the same way they began. Quietly. Without explanation. Without closure. The Atlantic returned to normal operations. Training flights resumed elsewhere. New deployments replaced old ones. The airspace remained busy and controlled. Yet the record remained unchanged. A sequence of observations that fit no known category. Data that could be reviewed but not resolved. And even now, when the case is referenced, it is described in simple terms. Unidentified aerial phenomena observed during routine U.S. Navy training operations. Nothing more is added. Nothing is taken away. The story continues exactly as it was recorded. With distance from the events, the Roosevelt encounters became a fixed reference rather than an active investigation. They were no longer unfolding in real time. They existed only through stored data and recorded memory. What remained important was how they were handled. There was no attempt to force an explanation. No effort to frame the events beyond what could be confirmed. The encounters were allowed to remain unresolved. This approach influenced how similar reports were treated afterward. Future sightings were logged more consistently. Pilots were encouraged to report without concern for stigma. Unknowns were treated as part of operational reality. The Roosevelt case did not provide answers, but it established a standard. Observe carefully. Record accurately. Avoid assumptions. In that way, the encounters continued to have impact long after the carrier left the Atlantic. Not through mystery, but through method. They showed that even in controlled environments, unexpected observations can occur. And when they do, the most reliable response is documentation, not speculation. That remains the final position of the Roosevelt encounters. A documented sequence of events, confirmed as real, left open by design. The sky above the Atlantic remains the same. Routine flights continue. Radar screens stay active. And somewhere within that routine, the memory of those observations continues quietly, unchanged, waiting for understanding that has not yet arrived. Time has not altered the facts of the Roosevelt encounters. The recordings remain the same. The reports have not been revised. The observations still describe objects that were present, tracked, and never identified. No additional context has been added by later analysis. The events are not framed as threats or breakthroughs. They are treated as unresolved observations within a controlled military environment. This is why the encounters continue to be referenced, not because of speculation, but because they meet a simple standard. Trained personnel observed something using reliable systems, and no confirmed explanation followed. The objects did not announce themselves. They did not interact. They did not leave behind evidence beyond sensor data and memory. They existed briefly within a defined space, and then were gone. The Roosevelt continued its mission. The pilots continued their careers. Operations moved forward without disruption. What remains is a record that does not demand belief or disbelief. It requires only acknowledgement. Something was there. It was observed. It was documented. And until new information emerges, that is where the story remains. There is no final statement that closes the Roosevelt encounters. No discovery that reframes them. No later event that explains what was seen during those training flights. They remain defined by restraint. The reports do not go beyond what instruments recorded and pilots observed. The language stays neutral. The facts stay fixed. In official terms, the encounters are classified simply as unidentified. Not hostile. Not friendly. Not explained. That classification has not changed. The ocean where the Roosevelt once operated remains active with traffic and training. Aircraft continue to launch and recover. Radar systems continue to scan the sky without pause. Most days, nothing unusual appears. But the record from 2014 and 2015 remains part of that system. Quietly stored. Occasionally referenced. Never resolved. And that is where this account rests. Not as a mystery built on imagination, but as a sequence of routine operations that intersected with something real, observable, and still unidentified. The story does not end. It simply remains open. What followed after that was not an investigation in the public sense, but continued observation within existing systems. The encounters were not treated as isolated anomalies anymore. They were treated as part of a category that required long-term attention. New reporting frameworks were introduced. Pilots were given clearer guidance on how to log unusual aerial activity. The goal was consistency, not interpretation. The Roosevelt encounters fit cleanly into this framework. They required no revision. The original reports already followed procedure. The data remained valid. Over time, the case became less about the specific objects and more about the process that recorded them. It demonstrated how modern detection systems work together. Radar, infrared, visual confirmation, independent witnesses. Each component supported the others. There was no need to revisit the events with new language or theories. The facts were sufficient on their own. And so, within military records, the encounters remain exactly as they were first documented. A calm sequence of routine flights. Repeated observations of unknown objects. Careful reporting. No conclusion. The sky did not change. The procedures did not fail. Only identification remained absent. That absence is what keeps the record relevant. Not as a story of discovery, but as an example of how even the most controlled environments can still produce observations that remain unanswered. Nothing further was added after that point. The Roosevelt encounters remained complete without expansion or revision. The original material stood on its own. They were not reopened because new evidence demanded it. They were not closed because answers were found. They simply remained documented. In later briefings and summaries, the case was referenced in the same way each time. Dates, location, sensor data, pilot observations. No speculation followed those points. That consistency became the defining feature of the encounters. Not mystery, but stability. The facts did not change as attention grew. For those reviewing the case years later, the conclusion was straightforward. The events were real. The recordings were authentic. The objects were unidentified. Nothing more was required to be said. The Roosevelt had completed its mission long ago. The Atlantic continued to host routine operations. Airspace remained monitored without interruption. And within that system, the encounters remained what they had always been. A clear record of observation without explanation. That is where the account rests. Not resolved. Not dismissed. Simply recorded. After that point, the case required no further development to remain relevant. It did not depend on new sightings or additional footage. Its significance came from how clearly it had already been recorded. The encounters showed that unidentified objects could operate for extended periods within monitored airspace without triggering alarms beyond standard safety reporting. They also showed that detection does not guarantee understanding. For analysts, the Roosevelt data remains useful because it is complete. It includes time frames, sensor types, pilot experience levels, and environmental conditions. Very few cases provide that level of consistency. Nothing in the record suggests error or exaggeration. The systems performed as designed. The pilots reported what they observed without interpretation. The process remained intact from start to finish. Because of this, the encounters continue to appear in discussions about airspace awareness and unidentified phenomena, not as an unresolved threat, and not as proof of any theory, but as a confirmed example of something observed without explanation. That is the final condition of the Roosevelt encounters. They are not ongoing. They are not evolving. They remain documented observations, preserved exactly as they occurred, continuing to exist within official records as unanswered but verified events. Since then, no additional clarification has been attached to the record. The encounters have not been reclassified. They have not been explained through later discoveries or technological advances. What exists today is the same material that existed at the end of the training period. Radar data showing controlled movement. Infrared footage capturing objects without clear propulsion. Pilot reports written immediately after observation. The case does not rely on interpretation. It does not require belief. It stands on documentation alone. That is why it continues to be referenced in official discussions about unidentified aerial phenomena. Not because it suggests a conclusion, but because it resists one. The Roosevelt encounters demonstrate a simple limitation. Even with constant monitoring, advanced sensors, and trained observers, not every object can be identified at the moment it is observed. Operations continue with that understanding. The sky remains monitored. Reporting remains active. And within that system, the events from 2014 and 2015 remain exactly where they belong. In the record, unchanged, unresolved, awaiting information that has not yet arrived.